everyone, we are back with another no spoiler Nancy Drew book review video. So I hope you guys have been enjoying these. I have been really enjoying making them, so it's always fun. And I have finished another 5 Nancy Drew books. So today in this video we are going to be doing quick no spoiler reviews of book number 11 through book number 15. So without further ado, let's just get into the video. One thing I thought would be a kind of a funny thing to kind of go along with these videos, I've noticed that as I've been reading a lot more Nancy Drew books, obviously there's a lot of formulas you kind of start to recognize after how the mystery's gonna go. You know, there's definitely a really set kind of way a lot of the stories go, which is definitely the case and kind of understandable. I mean, it is a kid's, you know, book series. But one thing I have noticed that has happened quite frequently is that there is the same kind of motif of there being an orphan or orphans in the book or the story. And I thought it'd be funny if we started an orphan counter, because I have read, up to this point, I've read 15 books now, and there have been orphans in a shocking amount of these stories. So moving forward, we will be doing an orphan counter throughout the series if we come across one in a story that we're reading. So to catch up to this point, so far I think I have found about 8 books that have included either an orphan or orphans or a partial orphan or someone who they think is an orphan but is not really an orphan. It's a common occurrence. So the first one we have is, of course, in the first book, The Secret of the Old Clock. And the orphan in the story is a little girl named Judy. Next up, I think the next orphan is in book number 3, The Bungalow Mystery, and the orphan's name is Laura. Next, I think she is an orphan. I'm not positive, so this could be a tentative one, but in book number 4, The Mystery of Lilac Inn, I wasn't sure, so I included her on this list, but I put Emily Willoughby as the orphan for this story, because I do know that she mentioned that her mother had left her an inheritance, if you will. If you've read the book, you know. But I'm not sure if she is a full orphan or just a partial orphan, so we're gonna call her an orphan for this one. If I'm wrong on any of these, you can definitely feel free and correct me, and if I've missed any, definitely let me know as well. Of course, I'm only up to book 15, so no spoilers, please. Then, of course, we have book number 6, which is The Secret of Redgate Farm, and the orphan in this one is Joanne. She lives with her grandmothers. Then, next up, we have a couple books where we don't have orphans, which is a surprise, but the next orphan appearance is in book number 9, The Sign of the Twisted Candles, and the orphan in this one is named Carol Whipple. And that brings us up to date to the current set of books that we're going to be talking about today. Spoiler alert, there are a couple of orphans in these books as well. So we're gonna pick up from here and start with the book review. Okay, so starting off with book number 11 here, this one is called The Clue of the Broken Locket. This one was originally published in 1934 and the revised story was published in 1965. And of course, one thing I really love about all of these books that I have today, they all have a little summary in the first few pages of the book, so I will of course be reading the summary from them rather than having to like write my own. So the summary of this book is: Nancy Drew and her friends are plunged into a network of strange events when they visit Misty Lake. The very night they arrive, they meet pretty red-haired Cicely Curtis, who seeks Nancy's help in solving 2 mysteries. One concerning Cicely's fiance, Nico Van Dyke, a popular singer who believes that his record company is cheating him of royalty payments. The other involving a family treasure hidden before the start of the Civil War. Cicely's only clue being half of a gold locket. Nancy's investigations lead her to Puddingstone Lodge, where the sinister Driscoll family lives. Elusive humming noises, a flashing light in the attic of the lodge, the periodic apparition of an excursion launch which had sunk in the Misty Lake years ago, and the fleeting appearances of a frightened girl who strongly resembles Cicely gives Nancy plenty of opportunity to test her sleuthing skills. Braving a series of dangerous situations and discouraging developments, the alert young detective perseveres in her attempts to solve both mysteries and reveal the astounding secrets of Puddingstone Lodge. So as far as this book goes, as I was reading it, I started to remember parts of the stories because this was one that I had read when I was a child, and I couldn't remember when I started this one if it was one I'd read or not because it seemed very familiar. The cover looked familiar, the title sounded a little familiar, but I wasn't positive I had read it or not until I started reading the book. I was probably about a third of the way in though before I realized, oh, this is definitely a book I read as a child, but I only remembered like a few key details, but I couldn't remember a lot of the story in here. There were just a few little random things that I did remember, however. So as far as my rating for this book, I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. It definitely wasn't the most amazing story, but it definitely wasn't the worst ones either. And another surprise, we have another orphan in this story. Cicely is, I guess she's considered an orphan in this one, so there is another one for the counter. The one thing though that kind of threw me off, and this is definitely an ongoing thing in the series, so Nancy is of course a resident of River Heights, but they never really tell you where River Heights is, and it's very vague. And I believe later on in the series they kind of insinuate or kind of hint at it being around like outside of Chicago, so being in Illinois, but I don't know if it's ever explicitly stated that River Heights is in Illinois or not. So in the very beginning of this book, Nancy gets a key from her father, and you know, he's explaining the soon-to-be mystery to her, and basically she has to go to somewhere in Maryland to pretty much just open up a cottage for a guest that's staying there. If we take broadly like generally Chicago to generally Baltimore, that is like a 10 or 11 hour drive, which is kind of insane to think of Nancy being like, yeah, Dad, I'll go drive 11 hours just to take this key to someone who mailed it to me. I get the whole point and the setup of it, but it just seems like a wild mystery. So I thought that was a little bit silly, but you know, of course, Nancy's mysteries take her all over the place, but I don't know. I just thought that would be quite a long drive. Another thing I wish a little bit more, so with the whole like phantom sightings in this story, I kind of wish they were a little bit more like integral to the storyline rather. Obviously it's there for a reason and it plays into the whole mystery, but it just seemed like a little bit of a weak kind of story in my opinion, with like how the spookiness is supposed to like kind of tie in. But overall I thought it was a pretty good story. I thought it was cute, like on par Nancy Drew. So I just kind of gave it like an average middle of the road rating for this one. It wasn't like one of the most thrilling or exciting or scary or anything like that, but it definitely wasn't the worst ones. It definitely had some good action in it as well, which is always very interesting. There were a few moments in here where I was just kind of like, what is going on here? And you know, things like that. So I always like having a mystery that's not super clear cut. And another thing about this book, it is actually this is of course the revised version of the story, but the original story is like so different from the revised story, and there are a couple more in this set of books I'm going to be reviewing that they are just completely different from the original story. So this is definitely one of those where it's like totally different. There's only like one or maybe two key elements that are the same in this book versus the original version. So maybe sometime in the future I would go back and reread the original version of this one. Some of the revised stories are just like, you know, more like a modernize the language, modernize like any stereotypes that they may have included, or like making the story more concise, or you know, things like that. But this one is just like a completely different story pretty much. That's one thing I always like to do when I finish a book. I like to go back and look at the like Wikipedia and see what's the difference between the two stories. So this could be when I go back and reread sometime in the future once I get through the entire series. All right, next up we have book number 12. This one is called The Message in the Hollow Oak. This one was originally published in 1935 and the revised story was published in 1972. And again, we will read their synopsis of the story. So this one reads, a group of professional detectives challenge Nancy to tackle a mystery that they have failed to solve. Find an invaluable message hidden by a missionary centuries ago in a hollow oak in Illinois. While searching the woods for the ancient tree, Nancy and her friends live with a group of young archaeologists who are excavating prehistoric Indian burial mounds on a nearby farm. A shadowy enemy stalks Nancy and harasses everyone at the dig. The young investigator pursues her dangerous adversary to an outlaw's cave and is threatened when she discovers an unusual treasure. How Nancy, with few clues to go on, solves this complex mystery will thrill all readers. So for this one, I have to say I was kind of surprised by this one. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to think of it just from reading the little synopsis before I got into the story, but I did rank this one a 4 out of 5 stars. So I thought this was a little bit more of like above average kind of Nancy Drew story, and it really surprised me because I don't know if I was really going to be interested in the whole like archaeology type of spin to this story. However, the one thing I would say, it just seemed a little unrealistic in the fact that like this university archaeology group would, you know, be here on a dig and they'd just be like, yeah, Nancy, you can come on in, you can dig with us and be all over the place and come on all over the site and everything like that, when she has no affiliation with them and no like expertise in archaeology or anything. I don't know. It's just kind of like the typical Nancy Drew, she gets a pass on everything, it seems. But that was the one kind of little key thing that I had in here that I thought seemed a little unrealistic. Another thing that I really liked about this book though is it does have another one of those like real world type of locations. So sometimes you'll have a Nancy Drew story where it takes place in a fictional town, and then sometimes you'll have some that take place in like a real world setting. And I always really prefer the real world settings because number one, it helps me imagine the setting a lot more. So this one's supposed to take place in southern Illinois, and they actually have a trip that they go on down the river, and it actually corresponds with actual towns in that geographical region. So I always like when the books are set in like a real world setting, so that one definitely was the case for this story. I do have to say though that the mystery itself seemed just a little bit weak for me based on how Nancy is supposed to find the treasure based on, I mean, like even the synopsis says, it's very limited clues that she has to go on, which just felt a little bit like, how would you ever solve something like this just because it's so vague? Again, and I'm speaking vaguely to try to not spoil anything, but you know, the clues that she has to go on are very limited. And then the one last thing in the very beginning, Nancy ends up going to New York to visit her Aunt Eloise, and that's kind of where she gets brought into the whole mystery of this story. But there is one spot, and this happens very early on, so this really isn't a spoiler at all, but there is a point where she's going to her aunt's apartment and she gets stuck in the elevator, and I was thinking from the very beginning, I was like, oh, I bet this is gonna come back around in the very end and it's all gonna tie together in a certain way. And it never does. And I was just kind of like, oh, that was a bit of a missed opportunity, how they could have like woven this into the overall mystery somehow, you know, because it was a very strange occurrence. But I guess sometimes random things happen to Nancy too that are just purely coincidental. And then the one last thing I wanted to mention about this book that I haven't seen in any other of my Nancy Drew books that I've read so far, this one actually includes a little postscript here, and it just kind of tells about like, you know, what Nancy does after the book, which is kind of interesting because I haven't seen it in any of the other books that I've read so far. So I'm interested to see if that was just something with a specific printing edition that they started doing or not. I do know that this specific edition would have been published after 2010 because it does have an ad for one of the Nancy Drew games there, and the copyright date is 2010 for that one, so it would have had to have been after that that they had included this postscript. But I don't know if that's just unique to this specific story or to this edition of book. I'm not sure, but I will keep my eye out for that in future books. All right, next up is the most recent book that I have finished. This is book number 13. This one is called The Mystery of the Ivory Charm. This one was originally published in 1935, and the revised story is from 1972. So for this one, it says, what secret life-giving power does the exquisite ivory elephant charm contain? Can the trinket really protect its wearer from all harm? Nancy Drew finds out when the owner of the Bingleton Wild Animal Show asks her to investigate one of the performers who may be involved in some mysterious illegal scheme. The girl detective's assignment becomes complicated when the elephant trainer's young assistant Rishi seeks refuge at the Drew house from his cruel foster father Ray. While following clues to help the boy find his real father, Nancy learns about an eerie abandoned house. She is harassed by its strange owner, Anita Allison, and the fiendish Ray. How Nancy uses the ivory charm, reunites a Maharaja with his son, and brings the evildoers to justice will mystify readers from beginning to end. And surprise, surprise, we have another orphan story in this one, so another one on the counter. Okay, guys, this story was kind of all over the place for me. I rarely have these moments where I'm reading a book and I have to like stop, reread over and over what I just read to make sense of it, and I found like I was doing that a lot in this book. So for this one, I have to say it was really a bit of a much darker kind of storyline than some of the other Nancy Drew stories that I've read so far. This one, I would say if you are someone who is very, very sensitive to any type of like child abuse kind of, you know, motifs or anything like that, or animal abuse, you know, you might want to skip this one. It's nothing like super graphic or detailed or anything, but that is kind of like an ongoing theme in the story about an abused child, which is always heartbreaking. And I don't know, this one just kind of had overall just a darker kind of feel to the entire story. And one thing that just absolutely confused the absolute heck out of me was in the summary it had mentioned this abandoned house, and it goes into detail describing the abandoned house, and I swear I had to read it like 3 times and being like, what do they mean by this? Like what is this place? It was kind of a weird one for me to kind of wrap my head around, so it was definitely weird. And there are 2 chapters back to back in this book that literally had me going like, WTF? It was kind of like a really weird spooky kind of 2 chapters, and one, again, without trying to like give any spoilers, one just kind of leaves me like, okay, I know this isn't really gonna happen because, you know, it's a Nancy Drew book, so this isn't really gonna happen, but there was a few kind of scary spots where I was just like, oh my gosh, what is going on? And with this one, you know, I don't know, it just, again, it kind of felt a little unrealistic when you get into the whole like villain side and like why they're doing what they're doing, and plot of it just kind of seemed a little unrealistic on this one, a little far-fetched, and this one's really got a lot of like mysticism worked into it too, which is another thing you don't really see too much in a Nancy Drew book, but this was definitely a roller coaster of a book as far as what the hell's going on in it. So overall, my rating for this one, I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars just because there were a lot of interesting parts and a lot of like action-filled parts, but it really kind of just took me all over the place, and I don't know, it was a bit much of a story. It was definitely a very different Nancy Drew story. All right, next up we have book number 14. This one is called The Whispering Statue. So this one was originally published in 1937 and revised was in 1972. So this one I actually read quite a while back. I read this one out of order. Before I had a larger Nancy Drew collection, I was reading them in order. So this one I actually kind of read several months ago, so my memory is a little bit hazier on this book, but I do remember overall really liking this one, and this is the summary for this one. Nancy Drew is asked to solve a puzzling mystery and impatiently is confronted with another, even more complicated. The first one concerns a valuable collection of rare books that Mrs. Horace Merriam commissioned a supposedly reputable art dealer to sell, but she now suspects that man is a swindler. The second mystery revolves around the baffling theft of a beautiful marble statue. To solve both mysteries, the famous young detective disguises herself and assumes a false identity. Despite these precautions, danger stalks Nancy's every move. An attempted kidnapping, a nearly disastrous sailboat collision, and an encounter with a dishonest sculptor are just a few of the exciting challenges that Nancy is faced with as she gathers evidence against a clever ring of art thieves. You will enjoy every moment of this thrill-packed story of how Nancy and her friends combine detective work and summer fun at a seaside resort. This story, I have to say, it starts off with a bang because 3 masked intruders break into Nancy's home. And I'm not going to say any more on that, but it just starts off like immediately with the action. One thing I really liked about this story is that this is the first time Nancy actually, you know, goes undercover in disguise. And she goes undercover as Debbie Lynbrook. And not only is it the first time she goes undercover, but she also even gets a job to solve the mystery, which I thought was a really interesting thing that we hadn't seen yet with any of the mysteries, and I really liked that about this book. And I don't know, I just found it really interesting. I also really love any time the Nancy Drew books are set in like a summer resort, like hotel kind of vacation-y vibe. I don't know why, it just makes me so like excited when that's kind of like the general setting, just because it just seems like a really fun time. And another thing with all the Nancy Drew books, you quickly learn to find out that Nancy is just amazing at everything. I think she's probably either just as, if not more, skilled than Barbie herself with all of the jobs and skills and talents and everything that Nancy can do. It's quite fascinating, especially like, who knew Nancy was an expert sailor? I didn't know. But in this book, you do find that out. And of course, I always love mysteries that kind of center around art or like museums or, you know, things like that nature. Like I always kind of love those kinds of mysteries. So this was definitely up my alley. And this is another case where the original text of the story is pretty much a completely different story than the revised one. So this is another one in the future I could probably see myself going back and reading, because it is like just nothing, almost nothing is the same from this book to the original. So for this one, I actually gave this one a 5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. I liked it quite a bit. I thought it was fun. There were a few silly moments in there as well that I was just kind of like, okay, come on. But overall, I really like this one and I think of this one fondly. All right, next up we have the last book for this video, and this one is book number 15. This is The Haunted Bridge. This is another one that I read a couple months ago, so it's a little bit, you know, removed from my immediate memory, but this one was published in 1937 and the revised story was published in 1972. All right, and the story of this one reads, Mr. Drew is on the trail of an international ring of jewel thieves and asks Nancy to assist him. The trail leads to a summer resort area. Before Nancy has a chance to start work on her father's case, a golf caddy tells her a frightening tale. In the dense woods nearby is an old wooden footbridge guarded haunted by a ghost. Intrigued by the caddie's story, Nancy decides to investigate. Several riddles confront the young detective as she attempts to solve the mystery of the haunted bridge and track down a woman suspected of being a key member of the gang of the jewel thieves. How Nancy finds answers to the two mysteries at the same time despite her injured hand, wins a trophy in a golf tournament, will thrill all Nancy Drew fans. So this one, I need to look further to see if this one has like the whole orphan motif in it. I feel like it might, but I don't think it's as pronounced. So I will put this on the counter for now, but I will need to double check before I publish. So this one was another one that really surprised me, and again, without reading the actual synopsis, you know, just looking at the cover of it and reading like the title and stuff, I had no idea that this was going to be a very golf heavy book, which I'm not gonna lie, I'm not a sports person at all, so I was like, oh my gosh, this is probably going to be a really like boring mystery for me because I'm just not into golf. And I am so surprised that I was actually really entertained by the story, and I found it so interesting, even though I'm totally not a golf person, but the whole like golf tournament was really kind of a fun little side plot to the whole story that I actually thought was really good. There's also like this plot line in it where Nancy has this very forward admirer and how she keeps trying to like dodge advances and like, you know, make up excuses to kind of get away from this guy, and it was just kind of like a really funny, I guess, kind of like side story to it, and has a bit of its own little mystery wrapped up in it as well. And another thing I sometimes like to do after I've read a book, I do like to kind of look at other people's ranking lists and just see like, you know, what did they think about this book? Did they rank it as high as me? Did they rank it lower as me? And this is one that I saw on a few of lists that, you know, people had kind of ranked as like not really one of their favorite books. And I could totally see that, but for some reason, this one just really interested me unexpectedly. So I really did enjoy this one, and I also gave this book 5 stars. So overall, I really enjoyed a lot of those books. I have to say, if I had to pick one of my favorites from this set of books, I think it's kind of like an equal tie between the Whispering Statue and the Haunted Bridge. I just liked these two the most. The covers are also very similar as well, so I don't know, sometimes you'll kind of see like these kind of themes that they'll do over and over, so this one definitely very similar book covers, especially with being back-to-back books as well. So overall, those are my thoughts on this next set of books in my no spoiler Nancy Drew book review. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram, link is below. Until my next video, I will talk to you guys later. Bye.